Online Course Design. Principles of Multimedia Learning. This video is part 1 of 2. The principles of multimedia learning derive from research by Richard Mayer and explain ways in which people learn more effectively. These principles are widely used in online course design, instructional videos, and e-learning to reduce cognitive overload and improve understanding. The cognitive principles of multimedia learning advocate for dual-channel processing of information, a visual channel and an auditory channel, each with limited capacity, necessitating designs that do not overwhelm either the visual or auditory pathways. Careful attention to the visual and auditory online design elements is needed, ensuring they are optimized to prevent sensory overload and enhance learning. Well-designed multimedia leverages both channels without overloading either. In the next slides, we'll go over each Myers principles of multimedia learning and share examples. Multimedia principle. People learn better when words and pictures are used rather than words alone. Combining text or narration with relevant visuals, such as diagrams, charts, or illustrations, helps learners build stronger mental connections between concepts. Pictures provide a visual representation of the information, which makes abstract ideas easier to understand and remember. Example: a diagram of the human heart with narration explaining blood flow is more effective than a text-only explanation. Coherence principle. People learn better when irrelevant words, images, sounds, or animations are removed. Common distractions include clip art that does not explain the concept, excessive icons or emojis, and background music in lecture videos. A better approach is to include only images that support the explanation, a clean slide background, and no background sound. Signaling principle. People learn better when important information is highlighted or signaled. Learning improves when important information is clearly emphasized using cues such as headings, bold text, arrows, steps in a process, or verbal emphasis in narration. These signals guide learners' attention to key ideas and help them understand how information is organized. By reducing the effort needed to figure out what is important, signaling helps learners focus on meaningful content and process it more effectively. Redundancy principle. People learn better from graphics with narration rather than graphics with narration plus on-screen text that repeats the narration. Too much duplicated information can overload working memory. When learners must read text while also listening to the same words and viewing visuals, their attention becomes split between channels. The spatial contiguity principle states that people learn better when related text and visuals are placed close together on the screen or page. When labels are positioned directly on or next to the parts of a diagram they describe, learners can immediately connect the visual element with its explanation. This reduces the need to search for information and lowers cognitive load. For example, in a pie chart, it is more effective to place labels directly on or next to each segment instead of listing them in a separate legend. When learners must constantly look back and forth between the graphic and a distant legend, it interrupts the learning process and makes interpretation slower and more difficult. In the comparison example, the legend placed below the chart requires students to match colors to categories, which increases visual and cognitive effort. It is also helpful to avoid relying solely on color coding to communicate information. When categories are identified only by color in a legend, learners with color vision or visual impairments may have difficulty interpreting the chart. Temporal contiguity principle. People learn better when corresponding narration and visuals appear on at the same time, rather than one after the other. For example, an instructor explains the parts of a diagram in a recorded lecture as the diagram appears on the screen. As the instructor says, "This section represents this stage," that part of the diagram is shown. As opposed to the instructor first describing all the parts of the diagram verbally and only afterward showing the diagram. Students must remember the earlier explanation while trying to match it to the visual, which increases cognitive load and makes learning more difficult. This principle is especially important in video lectures, animations, narrated slides, and demonstrations. The pre-training principle states that people learn better when they already know the names, definitions, and basic characteristics of key components before they are asked to learn a more complex process. When learners are first introduced to essential terms, parts, or concepts, they can focus their attention on understanding how those components interact rather than trying to figure out what each element is while the process is being explained. Introduce key vocabulary and acronyms before presenting more complex material. If acronyms are used, spell them out several times at the beginning so students become familiar with their meaning. After students have seen the full term multiple times, the acronym can be used more consistently throughout the rest of the content. For example, before explaining the process of cellular respiration, an instructor first introduces or reviews the parts of a cell and other important components involved in the process. By understanding these elements ahead of time, students are better prepared to follow the process. Segmenting principle. People learn better when content is delivered in short chunks rather than long continuous lectures. A 30-60-minute lecture recording is a problem because students may experience attention fatigue and cognitive overload. Instead of a 30-minute lecture, chunk the content into multiple shorter videos, for example, 5-minute terminology, definitions, data, prevalence, and context, 7-minute concept introduction, 7-minute example, 5-minute application, and 6-minute summary and recap. Modality, principle. People learn better when graphics are combined with an explained narration. Instead of filling slides with paragraphs, use a simple diagram, image, or chart and explain it verbally. This works because it distributes processing between visual and auditory channels. For example, showing a slide with a visual diagram of a process while narrating the explanation. Personalization principle. People learn better when content is presented in a conversational tone. For example, now let's look at how the heart pumps blood, rather than a more technical narration style. Voice principle. People learn better when narration is spoken in a human voice, rather than a robotic or synthetic voice. A human voice typically has natural pacing, tone, and inflection, which helps listeners stay engaged and better understand the information being presented. Although many synthetic or AI-generated voices are designed to replicate human speech, they can still sound mechanical or lack consistent speech patterns and natural inflection. As a result, the learning experience may feel less personal or less connected. This principle is especially relevant in courses taught by an instructor rather than in generic training videos. When students hear narration recorded by their instructor, they recognize the voice and communication style they associate with the course. This familiarity can strengthen the sense of instructor presence and help create a more engaging learning experience. For these reasons, whenever possible, using your own voice for narration is generally more effective than relying on synthetic or automated voices. Synthetic added narrations are, in theory, recordings of human voices, but the speech inflections may lack consistency. And if you're teaching a class, as opposed to a training video, students will be familiar with your voice and speech. Image principle. Seeing the instructor's face on the screen does not necessarily improve learning compared with graphics and narration alone. What matters more for learning is how clearly the instructional content is presented. Well-designed visuals paired with clear narration help learners focus on the key concepts, while showing the instructor may help create a sense of social presence or connection in some contexts. It does not inherently increase understanding of the material. Sensory-informed multimedia use in course design. Assess the need to include elements using this checklist. Are visuals used instead of large blocks of text? Are key ideas highlighted? Are unnecessary graphics removed? Is the lecture broken into shorter segments? And Are labels placed close to visuals?